Hello, and welcome to another edition
of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Our guest is AJ Bauer, PhD, and I have a soft spot for PhDs. You can find him on Twitter at AJ Bauer. He's a writer, editor, journalist, and academic. My name is Neil Parekh. I am the executive producer of the show and guest host. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and our Digimentors website. Please like, please comment, please share. In particular, I want to thank everyone who's watching on replay, who's usually the folks who catch the very beginning of the show. Thank you for doing that. I'm just taking a moment to go live on Instagram on both channels. We're live on both my Instagram and on Digimentors Instagram account. Please let us know where you're watching from. We are always happy to see folks and always happy to acknowledge folks who are watching. So far, we have Doug Levy joining us from Northern California. Doug, always great to see you. Thank you very much. And Jonathan, who's watching from the East Village. Jonathan, thank you as well. Always great to have our friends. What's interesting, the way that I figure it, is we have about 70% of our audience are regular folks, our New York Times read along family, if you will, and then the rest are people who maybe come to it that particular week because of the guest or because of some of the topics that we're covering. So we definitely want to thank folks for watching. And we have our guest AJ watching on YouTube in the background. AJ, thank you so much. Make sure you turn the volume off on that YouTube channel so we don't get any feedback. Although with the AirPods, it may not be an issue. But we have an international audience today. Annika is watching from Berlin. Annika, thank you so much. First time I recognize your name. So if you're a first time commenter, thank you. If you're a first time viewer, even better. My mom is watching from Hastings on Hudson, New York. Mom, thank you. I have to do my wave to my mom every time. Hi, Mom. Dr. Tachi is also watching on YouTube, saying hello from Fort Lauderdale. And AJ says hi to my mom as well. This is going to be fun. Miriam is watching from Hell's Kitchen in New York City on Facebook. Will also watch on my TV on YouTube. And that's what I think it works really well to watch on YouTube and then comment from a different channel on a device. Pradnya is watching from Silver Spring, Maryland, and we're getting some already some feedback. AJ Bauer, I think maybe knows Annika. Is that possible? We'll ask later when he comes on. I know AJ is very active on Twitter. We have Ken Fisher watching from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Thank you, Ken. I think I caught Pradnya watching from Silver Spring. In case I didn't, wanted to make sure. Pradnya, thank you so much for watching. I hope it's okay. It's not Uncle Sri this week. It's me stepping in as the guest host, but I appreciate you watching nonetheless. Naomi is watching, offering salutations, frigid Upper West Side. And it is very cold. Even I'm here in Washington, D.C., very cold this weekend. Patty Freudenberg is watching from New York. Thank you, Patty. Deborah, who is also in the DMV, the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area in Arlington, is watching. But she's in Colonial Williamsburg this morning. So thank you for tuning in, even while you're out of town. Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar is watching on Twitter. Good morning, all. Watching with her parents. Big fans of Sri and your parents, Neil. Thank you, Sujana. And you know the feeling is mutual. We love the work that you do. I love being able to work with you, producing events for for work for AOS, the American Autological Society. We produced She's on Call for a long time. And I will say, still thankful for the consult that Dr. Sujana gave me when I had to have ear surgery. We truly are a full family. And thank you, Pradnya. We love Neil Uncle too. That's what I wanted to hear this morning. Paula Kiger is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. Paula, of course, is a longtime producer for the show. And thank you so much for your continued support. Kathleen is watching from Los Angeles as well. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We also have some folks watching on Instagram. Layla Pinto is watching. So thank you, Layla. Appreciate that. We have a great show planned for today. AJ is a professor of journalism, an assistant professor at University of Alabama, focusing on conservative news and right-wing media. So before we get to that, we'll definitely talk about look at what's in the paper. We'll take a look at the front page of each section, as we usually do. I want to give a quick shout out. Someone is saying hi to AJ specifically, Inside Out Complex. So I wanted to make sure AJ saw that, and he did. But before we go into the paper, a few quick announcements. I want to specifically thank our sponsor, MuckRack, longtime sponsor of the New York Times Read Along and a general partner for a lot of Sri's projects. So thank you so much to MuckRack for all of your support. We want to remind folks that this show is produced by Digimentors, the consulting firm that Sri set up with his friend Andrew Lee. If you're interested in having us work with you on digital marketing, on events and programs like this, on strategic communications, trainings, workshops, staffing, and recruiting, we also help amplify events. Give us an email, sri@digimentors.group or neil@digimentors.group, and we'd love to work with you. Another show that Digimentors is helping to produce that I'm so proud to have their support is Shining Light on Shadows. We have a new episode coming up. It's a new show that I started focusing on mental health, a candid conversation about mental health. My co-host is Dawn Helmrich, and our guest this week on Thursday might be familiar to some longtime read-along fans. Brian Miller is going to be our guest. Brian was the chief restaurant critic at the New York Times for 10 years and for 15 years rather. And for that whole time, he suffered from absolute debilitating depression. And he was both a celebrity in the New York restaurant world and also carrying this huge burden until he just couldn't anymore and had to walk away. So he'll be our guest this Thursday. More about that show later in this episode. I'll give you a little bit more background on what we'll be talking about and share blog posts that I wrote and that Dawn wrote for the show. But with that, I want to bring in the newspaper, the New York Times, so we can take a look at what's in the paper and what is on the front page of each section, and then we will go ahead and bring in AJ to talk about his work and the news. So the front page of the paper actually has a big display story, and I haven't read it yet, but it's trapped in the brutality of India's sugarcane fields. And excuse me, I'm going to drink some of my water that my mom reminded me to have with me. Because I have something in my throat. Trapped in the brutality of India's sugarcane fields. The caption, workers in Bede, India near NSL Sugars, which is a Coca-Cola and PepsiCo a franchisee supplier that has mills around the country. In this article, it talks about the brutality. There's the pull quote, women feel pressured into hysterectomies. So we'll definitely want to take a look at that later. The lead, of course, is this horrific attack in Russia. Arrest and attack on Russian venue. Toll surpasses 130. Though an ISIS branch took responsibility, Putin claims Ukraine had a role. But it was a horrific attack that we saw the other day. Below the fold, another just horrible story, sad story. Princess Kate wrests control of rumor mill. So this is, if you heard the news over the last few months, there have been questions about Princess Kate and her health. She announced this week that she had been diagnosed with cancer, and we don't know the details yet. But this is about her taking control of the messaging. Excuse me. The other picture on the front page: warm hearts and cold noses help a school heal. Hudson the Golden Doodle has helped the Boltons heal since National School Shooting last year. That's really interesting. All the dog lovers out there can certainly appreciate that. Testing limits and calling out anti Semitism. Here's an article about Kenneth Marcus, then an official in the U.S. Department of Education, watched with unease as pro Palestinian protest shook college campuses. We certainly saw and have talked about this in terms of the hearings that took place several months ago, the university presidents who lost their jobs, some say unfairly, over the protests on campus. Another article: range of issues of EVs stokes partisan battle. So that's the front page, and we will certainly get to that later in the show. We have the business section, and we definitely are going to be talking about this article. Really, I think the design is interesting in terms of the layout. You see the graphic with the screenshots of tweets. The headline: "Tweeting with a Vengeance." With over 1 million followers on X, the hedge funder Bill Ackman has made himself an outspoken force. The other article on the front page: Jonathan Haidt has an idea to fix Gen Z. Get off your phone, says the author, who criticizes coddling of young people. So we'll take a closer look at that later. Sports, for all you baseball fans out there, opening day is coming up this week, and this is a baseball preview. The cover story: we don't care if we never get back. Bats are cracking, gloves are popping, and hopes are blooming. What could be better? I'm particularly interested. We don't usually talk about sports on the show. It's a big deal, but I'm curious about what they did with the baseball preview, given the shuttering of the New York Times sports desk and moving all the sports work to the Athletic. So that'll be interesting. Sunday Opinion. There are several articles here that I want to take a look at. The cover: the rupture. For decades, liberalism and Zionism were the twin pillars of American Jewish life. What happens when they can no longer be reconciled? And that's a full page graphic to show that. Arts and Leisure. I'm going to take a moment and pause here. Can anyone recognize who this is just with the eyes? Maybe you need the nose too, just to see. Can you tell who that is? Anybody? Anybody? And the first one, AJ's on top of it. Who? The Who. Peter Townsend on Tommy. The Who rocker discusses the trauma at the root of his Broadway musical revival and its joy. That should be interesting for anyone who likes classic rock. Pete Townsend talking about Tommy. Sunday Style, turning the page. Gisele Bundchen, 18 months after her divorce from Tom Brady, has a new life in Miami and is releasing a cookbook, Nourish. That's in Sunday Styles. The book review: a climate refugee yearns to understand where she comes from in The Morningside, Taya Obrecht's new novel. At Home in the Water. The magazine, it's the Voyages issue, so that'll certainly have a lot of interesting travel. And I checked because last time when I was looking for the poem, I couldn't find it. It's not in the magazine this week, so I'm not going to be looking for the poem like I did last time. But if we get some chance, we'll take a look at the Voyages issue. And then there's also a T magazine, the monthly design magazine that New York Times has. Art Lives Here, the places where artists rest, work, and dream, from New York to the Japanese seaside. So that's our tour of the New York Times. It gives you a sense of what's in the paper, what we might be focusing on. Uh, a lot of interesting articles to get to, and we're certainly looking forward to that. So, with that, we will remind folks that our guest this Sunday morning is AJ Bauer. He's a professor, assistant professor at the University of Alabama, writer, editor, journalist, academic. He focuses on conservative media and right wing news. And there's certainly a lot to talk about in this week's paper. So, with that, we want to bring in um, AJ Bauer. AJ, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Neil.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to this episode. There's a lot to cover in the newspaper. We want to talk to folks about your area work, etc. But the first thing I want to start out with is just on a lighter side. Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. We had you join us in the studio 8:15, as we do, just so we can be prepared. What would you be doing on a Sunday morning if you weren't joining us?
Well, I'm joining you from sunny Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where we are in Central Time. So it's
I
currently 7:45, but
forgot about that.
7:47 my time. So you'll all be happy to know I went to bed at 9:30 last night, just so that I could wake up and be perky for you this morning. I woke up at 5:30, had my full morning routine, so I'm ready to go.
That
It's actually not cold here. I know a lot of the East Coast is kind of buckled down today. I apologize. I wish I was in Brooklyn suffering with y'all, but it's very pleasant spring day here in Tuscaloosa.
and what would you be doing if you weren't up so early? Would you
Oh,
still be sleeping?
sleeping.
Yeah.
No, I'd probably be awake. Actually, what time? 7:45. I'd probably be like making coffee, I would think. Yeah, I'm usually up around 6:30, I'd say, on
Okay.
a day to day. 7:30 your time, Eastern time.
That's not bad. That's not
Yeah.
bad. We had a couple of people join in from the very beginning when we were saying hi. Annika from Berlin, somebody you know?
Oh yeah, Annika's actually very a big figure in Germany. Just authored a book, or came out with a book that was a major bestseller there on the U.S. American right. So if y'all read German and you're interested in right wing stuff, I would definitely give Annika a read.
Or if not, maybe she'd be interested in being on the show. If we
Have to ask her.
don't speak German, maybe she could explain the book to us. Annika, get in touch. Send me an
Get in touch,
email
Annika.
or get in touch if you want over Twitter. It'd be great to talk to you about it. And the timing won't be too bad for her in Germany, right? That'd
No,
be like
totally.
what,
Yeah,
2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that.
absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, much easier.
and let's see who else. Inside Outside Complex saying hello on. Was that someone you knew or just someone saying hi on
I don't know. They
YouTube?
seem wonderful. I don't know.
Great.
I'm happy for all guests, all comers here.
Good, good. We have Diane Stefani watching from Margate, New Jersey. Diane is a regular viewer and has also been great
Thanks.
about giving us suggestions for folks who would be on the show. So again, if you have any thoughts, folks who are watching, let us know. We're always looking for guests. Um, Ellen is watching from the Upper East Side in New York City. Thank you, Ellen. Um, and Pradnya has a comment about Kate. She's no longer Kate Middleton in terms of people referring to Princess Kate incorrectly. So, Pradnya, what's the correction? How should we be? Is it Duchess? Is it
I think
Catherine?
it's princess, right? It's like
Princess,
princess of
Princess Catherine? Or Princess
something
of,
Windsor.
yeah? Let's see if Pradnya
I
has.
thought she was gonna say, we've been joking here, is she cake? So like Cake Middleton has been the joke
Oh,
here. So I don't know, maybe that's the reference.
and folks who are chiming in, let's see. Um, and Pradnya is teeing up a question for you. It'd be interesting to hear how you manage these topics from Alabama, the heart of conservatism. Alabama's been in the news recently for several legislative proposals. So we'll let you think about that for a moment before we pull that out.
Happy to
Um,
chat.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and and Pradnya gave us the answer. It's Catherine, Princess of Wales, is how we should be referring to her. So thank you, Pradnya. So AJ, about your work and
Yeah.
your area of interest, and in that context of doing it from Alabama, you focus on conservative media, conservative news, and right wing media. Um, what kind of reception have you gotten doing that in Alabama? I mean, it'd be one thing to do that in New York, where you may have a more receptive audience. Are folks taking to that down south?
Well, I think so. I think it's worth noting that both the town of Tuscaloosa, Northport, which is just north of us, as well as Central Brooklyn, have like not different, degrees of partisanship. I think that there's a way that people read quote unquote red states and blue states as though they're homogeneously blue and red. But when in 2016, for example, I was living in Midwood in Brooklyn, and I think the vote there for Trump versus Clinton was about on par with the vote for Trump versus Clinton here in Tuscaloosa. So
Wow.
if you're I mean, obviously the demographics are quite different. That's a highly Orthodox Jewish community. This community has almost no Jewish people,
Sure.
very few Jewish people. And so yeah, the demographics, ethnically, et cetera, are different. But in terms of politics, I think you'd find more similarities than you'd think. But for me, I split my time between Brooklyn and Kensington now. Shout out Kensington. All you New Yorkers had better be eating bagels or at least like egg and cheese on a roll or something like that this morning because I can't get that here. Um, but I split my time between Brooklyn and here in Tuscaloosa, and I find it pretty useful, actually, because I get to dabble with the sorts of conservatism that go on in Long Island, in Central Brooklyn, and see it as you are all much more familiar with, perhaps down here or down south.
And one thing in terms of understanding that the nuance of politics in various geographies, it's not just kind of nothing's all red or all blue. You have college towns that make a big difference around a university area. But I know from when I lived in Washington State, a bastion of liberalism and progressivism, particularly Seattle. We had the Cascade Curtain, as we called it, the Cascade Mountains on the east side of the mountains. It was as conservative as it comes until you got to Spokane, another college town. So it really is there are more nuances than just Alabama or just New York, and certainly even within New York State, you do get some conservative areas. For a long time, Staten Island was a Republican bastion. Even
Still is.
Barrows still is for the most part. They've gone a little bit back and forth. After Molinari, after Guy Molinari going back several years, and Susan, they haven't had as strong a hold. I think a Democrat won in one election over there, but certainly. And
Absolutely.
Dr. Tachi is sharing on Facebook that she lived in Midwood for a bit as well. So
Nice.
that's interesting.
I was on Ocean and Avenue J. That was where I was, if anybody's interested. It's a nice building.
Okay, great, great. So let's go right into the work that you've done, kind of over your kind of body of work. What has been? I mean, you've had specific areas that you've looked into, certain bits of research, but kind of is there an overall theme? Is there a through line in terms of the research you've done, the academic work you've done around conservative media?
Yeah, so I'm primarily a historian these days. I do interview based and ethnographic research as well. But I started getting interested in this topic back in 2010. I was in grad school and interested in nationalism, and the Tea Party movement was popping off. And so I decided my first project was ethnography. So that means you go and engage in participant observation, interview, attend meetings, that sort of thing, with the Tea Party movement in the summer of 2010. I spent a month in Boston, kind of greater Boston Tea Party, and a month in Dallas, Fort Worth, where I'm from originally in Texas. And so I spent hours with Tea Partiers. I had about, I think, 36 hours of in-depth interviews. I attended something like 24 rallies and meetings and those sorts of things. And one thing that struck me about the Tea Party movement is at the time, a lot of the models for thinking about right-wing media was what we might could call like a hypodermic needle model, where people kind of felt that right-wingers were super influenced by Fox News. They were consuming media uncritically. This was a time when the thesis of the echo chamber was very prevalent. So the idea was that the reason that right-wing people believe what they believe is because they're kind of inundated and consumed by right-wing content, don't really connect at all with content outside. And what I learned by interviewing Tea Partiers is that almost all of them consumed a wide array of information and news. So folks who were at the time consuming the Times, consuming Al Jazeera, consuming CNN in addition to Fox, right? I didn't find anybody, I mean, maybe one or two with homogenous media diets. Most people had kind of omnivorous media diets in some ways, and so politically omnivorous. And so that got me thinking, how do we think about conservatives and their consumption of media in a more nuanced way? I was tired of interviewing and being in the field. It's a pretty intensive process. And I decided I kind of want to do something that's more of a historical project. So the book I'm working on, and I just signed a contract with Columbia University Press, so I should be finishing that in the coming year or so, is called Making the Liberal Media. And the purpose of that book is to understand where this conservative critical disposition towards the mainstream press comes from, right? And part of what I'm looking at, the book is kind of bookended by the 1940s to the 1980s, is not Fox News, not even Rush Limbaugh talk radio, right? The talk radio is kind of the very end of the book. I'm mostly interested in how did conservatives come to distrust the mainstream press and be seeking out alternative means of gaining information and commentary. So it's almost a prehistory of the audience that allowed, Rush Limbaugh and later Fox News to be so successful.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, and I think this ties into our discussion about Alabama in particular.
Yeah.
But in terms of the media diet for conservatives in particular. So I'll we try not to be too biased. We don't we have on the show kind of a journalistic mindset, if you will, but we don't take that to the extreme of we have to be objective in all things. Sri and I certainly have our opinions. We're not afraid to share them. I'm certainly more progressive than anything else. I don't watch Fox News. Thank you for watching it for me, and for others who do that. I don't think I could stomach it. But as someone who isn't looking at conservative viewing habits, my assumption would be that there are people on the right who that's all they watch. And you said that they actually watch more than just Fox News. That you mentioned Al Jazeera, you mentioned others. Is that part of the problem in both the cases? On the right, for example, they probably think all I watch is MSNBC and read the New York Times. Vice versa. Is that part of the problem that we have in terms of discourse?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we always assume the person we disagree with is wrong because they haven't read enough or that they're not critically thinking. And I think a lot of the times they have critically thought, using their own critical processes. They've read what they think is important, right? The problem is we disagree, right? And I think that a lot of, the mis and disinformation discourse that, is prevalent, a lot of the conversation about, right-wing people being like pro-fascist and these sorts of things. There are certainly pro-fascists out there, right? It isn't because they're incorrect or have a fact wrong. It's because they disagree. They have different kind of moral values, different ways of structuring the world, belief in the naturalness of hierarchy, right? I think that we would do better if we stopped pretending as though our disagreements were rooted in disputes over facts and started engaging with the fact that our disagreements are about much bigger concepts and much more structurally difficult to reckon with, right? How do you convince somebody, right, that gender is a social construct if they are deeply embedded and wedded in this idea of natural binary, right? And I think that this is an area where if we talk about conservative media, right, the New York Times actually has played a pretty important role in mainstreaming a lot of critique of the kind of more expansive notions of gender that are increasingly being understood within gender studies and other kinds of academic disciplines, trying to kind of be like, oh, well, maybe we're going too far, right? And so I think that even our distinctions about where right-wing media begins and ends, right? It's not just Fox News, right? And I wrote a book or co-edited a book. It's this way behind my over there, called News on the Right, where part of what we're talking about, my co-editor and I, is conservative news cultures. And the idea here is that conservative news isn't just a kind of production reception problem for people that consume it, right? All of us experience conservative news vicariously through Twitter, through the way that the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC will cover, outlandish things that's said on right-wing media, the way that right-wing media structures the debate. So, for example, right now in New York, we've got Eric Adams and Kathy Hochul, both of whom have extremely militant policies vis-a-vis the border and migration. Where did they get that from, right? They got that from Donald Trump, and they got that from concern that conservative voters are, not friendly or not willing to accept migrants into their communities, right? And so we see even the Democratic Party and the New York Times in some ways a ceding terrain, discursive and political terrain, to right-wing media, to the Republican Party. And so I think we need to have a clearer conversation of what our core values are, and then defend those, articulate a vision of what those core values are, rather than getting into this kind of back and forth, oh, somebody's got their fact wrong, this sort of thing.
Well, but and I'm glad that you ended on that note, because I want to go back to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, when I came of age, was the senator in New York, and was just a great intellectual. Your people are entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. And when you look at folks who are generally on the right, more conservative, and you take an event like January 6th, where people are denying what actually happened, what people saw with their own eyes, what my neighbor, who is a Capitol Hill police officer, a bike officer, experienced, and I've talked to him about the trauma that they went through, that his colleagues went through. How do you have a discussion with people who just have a completely different set of facts involved? It's one thing if we have different opinions, and we I think it's a more difficult conversation to have, a conversation to talk about gender issues and binary, non-binary, whether that's a fact or opinion. I don't think we're there yet as a society, but I think with January 6th, how do you have a conversation with someone who just denies that it happened, that they were just tourists walking through the Capitol?
Um, I don't think it matters. Like, I don't think it matters whether anybody who was at January 6th thinks or doesn't think a vote was stolen or whatever. What matters is they wanted to reclaim and maintain power. That's it. Like, January 6th was about claiming power and attempting to hold power, period. That's not a question of, look, oh, well, actually, if there was 5 more votes in this state or this district or whatever, then I'm not going to show up. It's, no, we want to maintain power, right? And I would dispute the idea that our society is not willing to talk about gender, because, again, that is also going against the facts, right? The facts is that gender is a social construct, right? And the fact that society isn't ready is just saying that society isn't willing, right, to admit the kind of natural plurality of gender, right? So, again, if we're talking about facts, it plays to both sides of what you were just saying.
Sure.
But no, I think that most of our discourse is focused on a presumption that the way that we solve politics is that we engage in interpersonal conversation and win arguments with one another.
Mhm.
And what I would say to that is, look at the percentage of Americans who support abortion rights. It's more than 50%. Do we have abortion rights in this country anymore? No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look at the percentage of this country that believes that climate change is real and that there ought to be government mitigations of climate change. Over 50%. What is the government doing to mitigate climate change, right? The problem isn't public opinion. The problem isn't that people believe or are misconstruing or having false senses of facts. It's that there is a disconnect, a fundamental disconnect between public opinion and what the government does. And so I think that we're continuing to operate as though we live in a representative democracy. I challenge whether that functionally is true and has been. And so, I think it's nice and fine if you want to convince your neighbors to believe the same things that you do. Like, that's part of what we do as individuals living within a liberal democratic society. But we should really be having a conversation about the gap between that process and the actual ability for us to influence what the government does.
So we have a good question from Dr. Tachi I want to bring up.
Yep.
Do you think conservative leadership fans the flames and conservative media simply picks up this fanning, essentially a top down approach? Or is it the reverse?
I do think it's somewhat top down or elite driven, is a way that we might call that, which is that a lot of the media, both liberal, mainstream, conservative media, are what scholars refer to as secondary definers, right? What they mean by that is that I mean, this happens less so on conservative news where you'll get like talking heads and pundits that'll say their take or be experts and that sort of thing. But let's say the New York Times, for example. In my reading, the New York Times has been getting more conservative on border issues. They've been more willing to talk about the border using militant terms, fear language, that sort of thing. The kinds of discourse you would typically see in right wing media, Fox News, that sort of thing. The reason for that is not necessarily that the Times editors have become more conservative or right wing or something like that. Part of the problem is that right now you see major party politicians on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, Eric Adams as well as Donald Trump, saying we've got a border crisis. We don't have room for these people. These people are a problem. We need to do something about that problem. If you've got both Republicans and Democrats saying that, then you have journalists who are trying to be impartial, who are trying to report both sides, who are relying on the experts and elites of both major political parties. And they're saying, well, we're seeing a consensus here, so we're going to write that consensus. And so I think that you're right, Dr. Tachi, that a really important component here is that the Democratic Party needs to hold its leaders accountable to articulating an alternative vision to that of the right. Because as long as the Democratic Party is kind of sidling up to conservatism, trying to appeal to middle voters, and what they mean by that is kind of center right voters, they're going to create a center right consensus that then we're going to see more and more appearing in our nominally impartial media reports like the New York Times. Oh, Neil, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I muted because I was coughing earlier. So thank you.
You're good.
I appreciate your comments on that and a great response to Dr. Tachi's question. I want to give a shout out to a couple folks watching on Instagram. Tim Fielder, who's at Diesel Funk, Laura Silverman, and Tracy Wickett, a former colleague from United Way. So thank you to folks watching on all channels. Again, we're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and our Digimentors website. Speaking of our website, Stephen Thrasher is watching, and he's saying hi from Chicago. You're smiling. Stephen is someone you know?
Yeah, Steven's a dear friend of mine. Everybody should read his book, The Viral Underclass.
The Viral Underclass. Great. Great shout out for that. Stephen, thank you for watching and for leaving me a comment on our site. And Dr. Tachi says thank you for your answer on that. I want to pull up an article that was in the New York Times, at least online, and I haven't seen it in print yet. But the way the New York Times works, they'll put stuff online when they're ready, and then figure out when to put it in print. Occasionally, they have a sprint special or print focus, but it's not synchronous. So it's just interesting to keep track of when things are online, when things are on print, or what's relegated to online. But this article is part of the Upshot series. The headline: Republicans who do not regularly watch Fox are less likely to back Trump. Again, Republicans who do not regularly watch Fox are less likely to back Trump. Survey data shows more of them believe he acted criminally. And it goes on to go into detail that Republicans who get their news from non-conservative mainstream media outlets are less likely to support Trump, based on a recent New York Times Siena College poll. You had a chance to take a look at this article. What did you take from this?
Yeah, so I really liked this article because it raises kind of a conundrum that scholars of right-wing media have been dealing with lately, which is that we've got kind of two different, somewhat contradictory rationales for what right-wing media does in our society, right? On the one hand, we've got this narrative that says right-wing media is kind of poisoning our democracy. It's convincing people who otherwise might not be right-wing to be right-wing, right? On the other hand, we've got this notion that, well, the reason that people tune in to right-wing media, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, et cetera, is that they are already predisposed towards those ideas, right? So this raises a conundrum, right? Are voters already predisposed toward right-wing ideas, or is the media causing them to be right-wing, right? And the answer is a little bit of both of these things, right? And that it depends on somewhat on an individual basis, right? I certainly have family members who tune in to say before he died, Rush Limbaugh or Fox News, right? Because they were already predisposed towards those ideas. And, you know, those media outlets kind of primed them to think about certain topics at certain moments, framed the discussions in certain ways, etc. There's also a possibility that some people may tune in not knowing that it's conservative and then kind of be drawn into that process in some ways. But I think that this piece does a good job of showing that this is kind of a multi-part, or there are multiple different entry points and rationales for what right-wing media does. It's a very complicated and nuanced component of our media system. I do think that what's interesting is this notion that if you kind of tune people off of Fox, that they'll be a little bit more moderate, or they'll perhaps believe things about Trump that they might not believe if they were only consuming Fox. I think that what you'll see, though, is that this doesn't really help us much in the real world, partly because most people don't only consume Fox. Many people consume a wide array of media, including folks who believe that, you know, Trump won the 2020 election, right? And so I think that it's difficult to kind of tweak the media system in a way that results in inevitable outcomes in popular support or public opinion, in part because people's public opinions are, you know, overdetermined, right? It's difficult to say we're going to tweak Fox News or get rid of Fox News or something like that, and all of a sudden we're going to have this kind of nice, liberal democracy. The solution isn't tweaking the kind of technocratically tweaking the media system. It's engaging in politics, right? It's framing a compelling progressive vision for the future that is able to appeal to wide swaths of the public.
And I think one of the challenges, and I'm blanking on the name, but I'm sure that you will pick me up. Fox News is not the end of the spectrum, if you will, in terms of conservative media. They
Right.
actually have pressure from the right
Yeah.
to hold on to their ground. What's the network that they're competing with?
So there's a couple. There's OAN, One American News
One
Network,
American
and
News,
then
yeah,
there's Newsmax, right?
and Newsmax.
And yeah, and so both of those seem to be doing relatively well, but again, nowhere near the numbers that Fox News is. I mean, Fox News, as far as I know, is still the top-rated cable news network, right? And has been for about 20 years. So that's a pretty hard, king of the mountain or king of the throne or whatever to kick off the mountain. That was a bad metaphor, but you get what I
But what's the dynamic between them in terms of, are these other channels, One America, Newsmax, pulling Fox to the right or keeping them on the right? Um, what's
mean.
the dynamic between them?
Yeah, so I don't know that they're keeping them on the right. I think Fox is already inclined that way. That's kind of their market share, right? I think that as we saw kind of with the revelations from the Dominion lawsuit last year, which obviously Fox News was sued for many, many millions of dollars, almost $1 billion, and around this time last year, right, settled, right, just as they were going to trial. A lot of the disclosure in that case revealed behind the scenes text messages, conversations among Fox executives, and it does seem that they at least are considering the fact that there are options to the right of them that they want to make sure that they're not losing audience to. And so surely the existence of outlets like OAN and Newsmax creates a rightward pressure to keep Fox from going too far to the center. Again, it remains to be seen whether that's changing all that much. I mean, Fox News has been pretty pro-Trump, has gone to bat and committed pretty serious lies for Trump over the last
Mhm.
several years. Um, Now, interestingly, early in say 2016, Fox News wasn't early in for Trump, right? They were kind of riding
Yeah,
the fence, seeing who was going to win. I think though. One thing that you can always count Fox on doing is when there's a Republican nominee, they're going to line up behind that nominee, regardless of who that is.
sure.
So even if Trump burned them in 2020, as indeed he did, I don't think that that's going to stop Fox from going full force behind Trump in
Sure.
2024, whatever year we're in. Yeah.
Well, it seems like 2020 all over again. That's the big criticism, right, of having a
Right.
Biden-Trump rematch.
Yeah.
But that's we're looking at 2024, and we're looking at the very real possibility, I think, of Trump winning in November,
Yeah.
which my line was always it was bad enough when Trump won in 2016, but you know you could almost forgive people. They didn't know what they were getting. They didn't know what was to come. If they had reelected him in 2020 after 4 years, I would have been really disappointed. And now even 4 years later, the idea of electing him is definitely scary. Um,
It definitely is scary. And I think that if you look at, for all the conversation about the white working class and those sorts of things, if you look at the most common demographic characteristic of people who voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, do you know what it was?
no.
Republicans.
Mm,
So if the Republican Party supports their nominee, you're going to get Trump again, I would imagine.
yeah.
And so I think that what you see some hope of is some folks like the Liz Cheneys of the world or whatever claiming, and like the, what is it, Mike Pence, right? Oh, I'm not going to endorse, but I'm not
Yeah.
going to vote for Biden, right?
Yeah.
If you see some Republicans with backbones being willing to stand up to Trump, I think we've got a chance. But otherwise, I think things are looking bleak.
Well, and they
Patty,
have.
yes, I do often feel like a defense attorney.
That Patty's asking on Facebook, and that's also it's an interesting kind of melding. I was going to say in terms of a Republican standing up to Trump, it also has to be the right Republican. It has to be someone with standing and who can hold their own against all the headwinds they're gonna face. MD watching on YouTube actually asked the question that I asked just a little bit afterward. But thank you for framing it that way and talking about the other Fox potentially trying to find a middle ground.
I think
Um,
that's a good question though, because News Nation, they were actually down here in Tuscaloosa in December for the Republican primary debate. News Nation is a new outlet. It's actually formerly WGN, that Chicago network. They've kind of rebranded.
oh wow, I didn't know
Um,
that.
yeah, and so their market positioning, MD, I would say is kind of center right. They claim to be this kind of pure center, right, in between the liberal and the conservative media. But if you're looking at CNN and you're saying that's liberal media, you're appealing to conservative viewers, right? CNN is extremely middle of the road. You could make a case for center right for CNN, even depending on your positionality, right? And so I think that my belief is that there isn't a big enough audience to justify News Nation in anything near, say, a CNN or an MSNBC or a Fox. I think that most people that think that OAN and Newsmax is too out there are pretty content with Fox and aren't going to be looking for a more moderate outlet. And I think folks who are find MSNBC too liberal but Fox too conservative are probably pretty fine with CNN. So I wouldn't think that Newsmax has much of a shot, but I guess I wish them well.
I want to give a quick shout out to some folks watching on Instagram, in particular on my channel. My colleague Candice Sanchez. I want to thank you for watching. I also want to thank Jeannie Newman, a teacher from high school who I'm still in touch with, who is tuning in. So thank you, Jeannie. And we also have the Standouters watching on our Digimentors Instagram channel, as well as a former colleague at Digimentors, Sneha Tatapuri. So thank you so much. Pradnya is asking, where is BBC on the spectrum? Where would you put them?
Yeah, so I think an interesting thing about the BBC is that it is not a commercial medium, right? It's state-run effectively, right? Although there are these kind of protections to keep it from being purely state-run in some regards, right? I think that having a sizable non-commercial option in the United States would be wonderful. I think that there hasn't been a whole lot of you know what's the word, will among political leaders for that. I think it would be pretty difficult to establish these days, given how contentious things are. It would require, for example, like Congress to get its act together, which I don't see happening anytime soon. But I think that BBC, in many ways like the New York Times, in many ways like CNN, right, is attempting, well, less entertainment driven than CNN perhaps, right? But in many ways is attempting to do this kind of what we would call a high modern notion of journalism, right? Being above the fray, objective, impartial to some degree, investing considerable resources in reporting and that sort of thing. And so, again, because it's in the UK context, it is on somewhat of a different spectrum, right? We could talk, I think it makes less sense to talk about a political spectrum that's transnational because each country has its own particular context. I think that the BBC, by nature of England being somewhat more connected with socialism or the socialist context, right, is going to be a little bit more left or liberal than a lot of U.S. media. But there are often, obviously, the long colonial legacy of the United Kingdom, BBC's kind of role in kind of covering and perpetuating that in some ways. I think that you couldn't necessarily just call it purely left or something like that. I think conservatives in the U.S. would certainly call it left media.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a comment that came in on Twitter as a reply to the live stream from Anita Joe. And she says that when Reagan cut the fairness doctrine, how did that change how we get the news? To be informed, we need to read it all. She says hashtags read more, write more. And when did we get to this place of telling each other how to think? I agree we are in a place of deep debate. She says the 18th century kind, in my opinion. Can you comment on the fairness doctrine and how that impacted things?
Absolutely. If you're interested in the fairness doctrine, buy my book because it's the bookend of the book. So the
Great.
fairness doctrine, for those who aren't
And before,
familiar,
let's do a proper pitch for it though. In terms of the book is News on the Right, Studying Conservative News Cultures, right? That came out
yes.
in 2019.
So yeah, buy that one for sure. Also buy the book that I'm writing now, which is called Making the Liberal Media. But so for those who aren't familiar with mid 20th century American broadcast policy, the Fairness Doctrine was a policy that lasted from 1949 until 1987. And it mandated that everyone with a broadcast license, basically radio and television stations and networks, that if they were going to air a particular opinion, or basically it did two things. It required broadcasters to air news content about controversial matters of public discussion, and to do so in a way that balanced both sides, right? So, if you had a pro-abortion person, you would need an anti-abortion person, right? If you had a pro-death penalty person, you would need an anti-death penalty person, right? The idea was to give the public both sides of whatever the debate was so that they could make up their minds, right? The question, though, makes it seem as though you get rid of the fairness doctrine and that this somehow impacts our ability to get both sides. I think one of the reasons that the fairness doctrine was necessary in its own terms was because we lived in a low choice media environment in the mid 20th century. Effectively, you had three television networks: ABC, CBS, NBC. This was before Fox, the broadcasting, not Fox News. That too, though. So you had three broadcasting networks. You'd have your local newspaper, maybe two if you're lucky, maybe a few if you're in New York or something like that. And then you'd have local radio stations, a handful of those as well. And so if all of those networks were just giving one particular vantage point, right, you weren't really getting much. If all of them were giving two vantage points, you still weren't getting the full array of political opportunities or discourses, right? One of the criticisms of the Fairness Doctrine is that it famously kind of bracketed more radical forms of ideology. So when you say both sides, it didn't mean that you also invited like a communist on or a fascist on or something, right? It was like the Republican and Democratic Party. It kept this kind of coherent kind of cordon around the two-party system. And so nowadays we live in an extremely high choice media environment. If you want to be like some obscure political ideology that I haven't even heard of from some country I haven't even heard of, right? You can probably find that online, right? And only consume. If I wanted to only consume Japanese news, right, I could do that, right? I mean, I don't read or speak Japanese, so I couldn't do that. But hypothetically, I could do that just by, subscribing to the right networks online and on cable and whatnot, right? So we have more opportunities to choose our media diet than ever before, which is part of a problem, right? Is that people are choosing things that they agree with, right, or that test them in a way that they approve of, right? So I don't think that the fairness doctrine has created the problem that we have now. I think probably the problem we have now is a result of technological innovation, right? There's really no way to enforce a fairness doctrine in the current climate. There has never been a fairness doctrine applied to print or the internet, for example. And so I think that the real decline of the fairness doctrine, I think, has been, I should say, the real legacy of the fairness doctrine has been the expectation that we as news consumers should be able to get multiple perspectives from the outlet that we do consume. And I think that that's actually kind of a weird thing to ask for or to demand, right? I think it's totally fine for news outlets to advocate for a position, to engage in investigative reporting that's designed to like solve a common social problem that isn't weighing both sides. The front page of the New York Times this morning, right, is about Pepsi and Coca-Cola using really horrible labor practices in
Sure.
India in terms of their sugarcane, right? You don't need to give, Coke and Pepsi equal time to justify why it's totally fine and reasonable, right, to exploit these workers, right? That's not necessarily balanced, right, to focus on the terrible things they're doing, but it's a public service. It's important, right? And again, what counts as the public service, unfortunately, is in the eye of the beholder, right? Conservatives are going to think going after Joe Biden and Hunter Biden or whatever is engaging in a public service. I disagree with that, but that's part of the kind of open political debate that we're involved in at this time.
Absolutely. I want to bring in a couple of comments before we make some announcements and go to the newspaper. But there's just a really great conversation. First of all, Patty said, excellent explanation. So thank you for that. And with regard to the fairness doctrine, Dr. Tashi asked about the SNL episode when Trump insisted that SNL have him on because he had Hillary on. Was that, where did that fall in terms of were they trying to honor the idea of the fairness doctrine? Were they just trying to mollify him?
So there used to be a regulation. This wasn't the fairness doctrine that did mandate that if the broadcaster like aired one candidate, they had to give equal time to the other. That has long since gone away as well. There's been like a maybe 20 or I would say, how old am I? A 40-year period of deregulation of federal
Hmm.
broadcast policy. And so
Hmm.
a lot of things that were expected in the mid 20th century aren't there anymore. That's one of them. And so I think that was more just SNL playing, politics to some degree, and also trying to capitalize on the fact that Donald Trump is a name that's going to get a lot of people to tune in. So I would say that's more like SNL being self-serving than them trying to like adhere to any kind of mid 20th century broadcast policy.
Sure. And
Yeah.
Patty asks, would you categorize, when we're switching to the New York Times, would you categorize the New York Times as nonpartisan or partisan or more favorable toward a specific side? And I'll make the clarification here uh, to differentiate between the opinion page and the news pages. Again, you can have opinions about where their news items fall out and where their reporters are. But as most newspapers try and do, the New York Times does to have a very strong distinction between their opinion pages and their news coverage. What do you think about the Times?
Yeah, I agree that the Times definitely attempts to distinguish between opinion and news. I do think that there's a little bit more bleeding between the two than I would prefer. But I think I have many friends who are reporters for the Times. They're great people. They do their research. They are excellent writers. The New York Times. I'm a subscriber to the Times. The New York Times is what we would call like adheres to what I would call at least professional journalistic ideology, that they see themselves as trying to be impartial, trying to be objective. Part of what that means, though, is again, they are secondary definers. They are relying on experts. They're relying on what the major political parties are saying at the moment, and then reporting both sides of that. That presents a problem. And I think this is one reason why, again, I was saying earlier, I'm seeing what I would consider to be conservative or right-wing framings around border issues, for example, around transgender rights, for example, around issues of free speech and diversity, equity, and inclusion on college campuses. I think that there's a way that the Times, because it is so focused on maintaining impartiality, that it gives more credence to bad faith right-wing actors than they should. I also think this notion of being a secondary definer, of saying, well, we're going to just say what the Republicans and Democrats think, because the Democratic Party is feckless and is not willing to stand up for progressive values and is increasingly attempting to adhere or appeal to conservative voters. The Democratic Party is creating a consensus on certain issues that is a right-wing consensus, in my determination. And that is appearing in Times framing, not because the Times is right-wing specifically, because I don't think that they are, but because the media system, or not the media system, our political system is creating unfavorable conditions for impartiality to result in a more balanced approach. So, for example, if you've got Eric Adams and Donald Trump both, preaching hate against migrants effectively, right? The Times isn't quite doing enough, I think, to say, here is another vision, right, of migrants as our neighbors who deserve care and support. The Times has spent way more time focusing on the problem of immigration than focusing on mutual aid efforts that are going on to help migrants throughout. I know in Brooklyn, there are many of them, providing winter coats, providing housing, providing food, right?
Sure.
So I think that would be where I would come down on that. In terms of the opinion page, I think that the Times is so concerned with the liberal media tag that the conservatives have been lobbing at it for decades, that they have hired way too many conservative columnists.
Absolutely.
I think that Jamel Bowie is like the only, in my opinion, like regular op-ed, or not op-ed, but opinion contributor who is doing good. Obviously they have like more occasional contributors like Tressie Cottom, right, who's wonderful as well. But their kind of regular roster is, there should be term limits, right? Maureen Dowd hasn't, I'm sorry, Maureen, you haven't had an interesting thing to say in 30 years, 20 years, right? I was in college. Iraq War, you were great. You were great in the Iraq War, right? Do something else with your life.
AJ, tell us how you really feel about Maureen.
I met Maureen in passing in college. She seems wonderful and nice. Like, I have no problems with Maureen Dowd, but her columns don't say anything anymore, and we just need to put them to bed.
We have a comment from MD saying, increasingly there's a lot of interesting conversations held on YouTube by British podcasters and startups like Talk TV, GB News. Are there US equivalents taking eyes away from CNN and Fox, or is their hold on the media landscape through cable just so strong? Are there chinks in that armor?
I think TikTok and Instagram are big. I mean, I'm sure podcasts
As
and
channels.
YouTube as well, right?
Yeah.
I don't know of any specific channels that are like dominant or something, but if I ask my students where they get their news from, it's like TikTok and Instagram, right? And word of mouth and things like that. Like, I don't think any of my students are watching CNN or Fox or MSNBC unless they're like visiting their parents or something. And so I think that this is somewhat of a generational issue, is that younger people are getting their news not from cable. And that's going to continue to be a downward slope for cable news providers, which you see them, right? Honestly, trying to make deals. I think CNN has a deal with Max, right? I sometimes catch CNN programming during like election season on there. You got NBC with Peacock, right? They're all trying to find these like streaming approaches that are trying to reestablish their news brands in streaming outlets. I think that there are, many YouTubers that attract attention, millions of viewers. I don't think that it's zero sum though, right?
Sure.
You can, if you've got the capacity for it, right, you can watch or listen to Joe Rogan and then go tune on CNN too, right? So yeah.
This is a fascinating discussion. A few more comments, and then we will move on. Mary Curtis, a former guest columnist for Roll Call,
Yeah.
agree with you totally. And the right has masterfully played the refs. The worst sin is to be called liberal media.
Yeah.
Miriam Berkeley says, I think the New York Times never talks about the reasons people come to this country, to the United States, and the part the U.S. has played in their internal affairs that may have led them to leave home. It's not people coming from Mexico necessarily, but from Guatemala, El Salvador, coming up north,
Right.
and the problems they're having in their home countries.
If
Uh,
you're interested in more of those narratives, I would really recommend highly The Border Chronicle, which is a good podcast by Melissa Del Bosque, who is a reporter, investigative reporter who lives on the border and has been reporting on border issues for decades. And she's doing the real work there that I wish more mainstream kind of East Coast media would do. Because what she was telling me, I was talking to her a few weeks ago, she sees right-wing news reporters on the border and they're writing and they're framing it in very unhelpful ways towards migrants. And you don't see as many, say, New York Times, Associated Press, CNN reporters doing real investigative reporting down there.
Thank you, AJ. A few quick announcements just to keep people aware of what's going on next week. We are not going to have a show. We will be taking the week off for Easter, but we will come back the week after on April 7th. Indira Somani will be our guest. She's a filmmaker, TV producer, former journalism professor, and she is working on a documentary about her mom called Mom and Me. Her mom actually suffered from depression after her husband passed away, and Indira is working on a documentary about that. Next Thursday, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have the next edition of Shining Light on Shadows, a candid conversation about mental health. Brian Miller, sorry about that. Brian Miller will be our guest. He is the former New York Times restaurant critic who was a guest on the New York Times read along 2 years ago. He's going to share his story. And here is we have some blog posts that we're going to be posting from him. The onset, he writes about the onset of a depression that almost took everything. The morning I tumbled into the jaws of mental illness in November of '83 was ordinary in every way. Little did I suspect that worse was to come and that it would be worse than anything I had ever imagined. He actually worked for 15 years as the chief restaurant critic on top of the world with debilitating depression. And at some point, he just gave up. He could not do it anymore. We're going to be focusing on workplace depression in that episode on Thursday. The blog post I wrote, Depression in the Workplace and When Working from Home. And the quote, people who suffer from anxiety, depression, or other mental health challenges are often called good actors. They can convince the world they're okay, even when they're anything but okay. And I encourage you to read the blog post if you can. And tune in for the show on Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Central. Dawn's blog post, my co-host, is about compassion and empathy in the workplace. She was afraid that if my boss, she writes, I was afraid that if my boss and others knew what I was going through, they wouldn't think I wasn't capable of doing my job. They would think I wasn't capable of doing my job. And we will be discussing these issues and more again Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for all of your support for that show. Again, it is produced with the support of Digimentors, and I can't thank my colleagues enough for their support of the work that we're doing to raise awareness about mental health issues and really to reduce the stigma around that. So our guest has been AJ Bauer. We're going to be switching gears and talking about the newspaper, and there's a lot to cover in this week's paper. So I'm going to come off camera and switch over to the newspaper and see what we have there, and then we'll go back to some comments that came in. Pradnya did ask if you can put it, AJ, what's the name of the podcast that you mentioned?
So
By the reporter at the border.
So Patty really helpfully posted the link in the chat,
Oh,
but it's called The Border Chronicle, and the reporter is Melissa Del Bosque.
there we go. Thank you for seeing that. Patty shared that in Facebook. For folks who are watching on YouTube, etc., you won't see it there, but you can find it on the screen, theborderchronicle.com, theborderchronicle.com. And also want to give a shout out to Rose Horowitz, who is joining from Connecticut. Interesting perspective and discussion. Nikhil is saying, great conversation, learned a lot. And we have a new regular, Dr. Chandrasekhar's dad. Loved the show. Thank you, Uncle. Appreciate you watching. All right, the newspaper finally at 9:40. Oh, so late. AJ, this was too good a conversation. We're gonna have to speed through some of this stuff,
You have to
but
rein
we
me
will
in.
do
Yep.
our best. We talked about the front page at the beginning of the show. There's a really interesting article about the sugarcane fields in Maharashtra in India. We definitely want to take a look at that. I do my caution, and I think the Times has been a little bit better over the last few years, but there's still, over the last 30 years of my reading the Times, um, 35 years going back into high school. Too many of the articles, particularly that I could tell from India, had an Orientalist perspective and really found, the off the wall stories about monkeys and temples and women still washing clothes against rocks and that type of thing. So whenever I see an article about India, I always uh, you know question what it's going to end up like. But with more reporters based in India, South Asians, presumably, this is written by a Mega Rajagopalan and a Kadri Inzamam. I have some hope about the way the coverage might look. Um, the Inside the Times article on page 2 is always my favorite. This one is making Times visuals accessible to all readers. The Times accessibility visuals editor is removing barriers in articles for those with disabilities. Certainly worth taking a look at. The Dateline, a new feature showing where Times reporters are reporting from around the world. They highlight Modesto, California, Panama, Hungary, and Seoul, South Korea. Seoul is they're focused on the opening of the baseball season in Seoul between the Padres and the Dodgers. Um, the international story: 41 days in a bunker. How much can one person endure? This is about the war in Ukraine. We have this article about Princess Catherine, Princess of Wales. I do want to point out that in the caption, Pradnya, they have it absolutely correct. Catherine, Princess of Wales, and in London, a widespread outpouring of sympathy.
It's remarkable to me that the New York Times in the United States is so focused on what's going on with the British monarchy. Like, I don't think we need to know. Like, I think people are interested, but is that why we're justifying our news around it? It was a front page story today. I don't think that deserves it. But
Well, and this is a few days after the announcement, so
exactly.
I'm sure that it was a bigger news 2 days ago.
Right.
There's still a huge fascination with the royals. I mean, going back to Princess Di's wedding, and then obviously with Queen Elizabeth and Prince now King Charles III, William, Harry, etc. Um, we have an article here: Mexican cartel scam is preying on seniors and their timeshares, and more coverage about Gaza. Gaza's shadow death toll in the thousands. Bodies buried beneath rubble in a 140 square mile graveyard. Um, more Russia and Ukraine. This is about the terrorist attack in Russia the other day. And a news analysis piece: deadly assault rattles Putin's image as protector of the homeland. And as we saw from the lead, he's trying to blame Ukraine for the assault. This is interesting. So this is the inside of the article, the jump on the article on uh, the sugarcane fields in India. So they're giving it a lot of real estate. You'll see the top half of the page here. Pull quote, I had to rush to work immediately after the operation as we had taken in advance. We neglect our health in front of money. Archana Ashok Chowre below began working in the sugarcane fields as a preteen and expects to continue for the rest of her life. 82,000 approximate number of women in the sugarcane labor industry, where 20% have had hysterectomies. I'm really curious about what the connection is between working in the sugarcane fields and hysterectomies. Um, and this quote on the side here: everywhere I went, a hysterectomy was suggested. Savita Dayanan Lange below left, a sugarcane cutter in her late 30s, lives in a tiny concrete home at the top of a hill. 1,800 advanced wage per couple, which is $5 a day per person for a season. So you see this in terms of the left half of the page. The bottom of the page, women feel trapped in a system's brutality. See several pictures there, and then the pictures, and then more pictures on the below the fold here on the right hand side, which is really inside the sugar mill in Satara district in Western India. From about October to March each year, the mills work nonstop. At left, a mother of a child bride leaving a counseling session in Bede. At right, Ranjit Bausaheb Wagmare, a contractor. And apologies to my family for mispronouncing some of these Indian names, but it is what it is.
Your mom's watching, Neil.
My mom's watching, Dr. Chandrasekhar's watching, but my excuse: India is such a diverse country. My parents are from Gujarat. I'm not going to get the names right from other sections of the country. That's just not going to happen.
I got you. I'm just joking.
Oh, I know, but there's guilt. There's guilt involved. There's more on the a third page here. They brought me by throwing me in the vehicle. I hadn't even taken a bath or anything. Mira Govardhan Bole married about a year after her first period. 90% of hysterectomy requests are approved in Bede, where doctors use the procedure to increase their profits. Definitely we'll read this in detail later. I'm just still stunned and trying to figure out this connection, trapped in the brutality of the sugarcane fields. It's the display story. Why are they pressured to feel hysterectomies? We're going to have to look into that. The national story, the lead story, is about the eclipse coming. It's Maine's time to shine. And I know that Buffalo is also focusing on the eclipse. They'll be in the path. Ohio senior senator faces an uphill climb. Sherrod Brown has a tough election in front of him in Ohio. Tennessee limits AI to protect performers, something that we've talked a lot about at Digimentors. Here is, we're going to keep going here. This is the article about in Nashville, warm hearts and cold noses help a school heal. Dogs being used for as therapy. And let's keep going. This is the national section. We will flip through because I know we want to get to some articles in the business side. So let's take a look. Sunday Business. So above the fold, this article about Bill Ackman tweeting with a vengeance. With over 1 million followers on X, hedge funder Bill Ackman has made himself an outspoken force. But the article beneath that, Jonathan Haidt has an idea to fix Gen Z. Get off your phone, says the author who criticizes coddling of young people. We'll go to the jump on this, and then I'll ask you your thoughts. There we go. Here's the article. So they give a lot of real estate inside. Big picture, Jonathan Haidt has an idea he thinks could fix Gen Z. What's your... you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt. Tell us a little about him.
Right. So not personally, but yeah. So I think that it's a thing that I find interesting that I think is explains a lot about the New York Times' kind of primary audience and focus is that this business section, which granted it's a business section, appealing to a certain degree of moneyed people. But we're seeing a major profile of a cranky billionaire who is most well known for pushing the first Black woman president out of Harvard over plagiarism scandals, and then getting self-dunked on because his wife was involved in a plagiarism scandal. Right, that's the lead in the story. But if we're talking about Jonathan Haidt, Jonathan Haidt has made a name for himself by claiming that the problem with college campuses is that students are too liberal and that liberalism makes them weak. Um, at a time where you have, in the state of Alabama, where I teach, laws that are going to be on the books starting in October, basically preventing the teaching of divisive concepts like race and gender. You have governments in Florida, Texas, Georgia as well doing these sorts of policies. You have people like Jonathan Haidt who are more concerned with liberal students wanting trigger warnings before having to deal with content like rape, right? And so to me, Jonathan Haidt's legacy is basically to distract us from the real censorship that is literally taking place on college campuses. You also see this, and you saw this in an earlier section as well with the man who helped redefine campus anti-Semitism. There is an overwhelming fixation in the New York Times on elite Ivy League education in this country, that despite the fact that it educates a negligible minority of the overall student population, most students are educated at public universities, land grants and otherwise throughout this country. The vision of higher education that you see, or that you would think exists if you read the New York Times, bears no resemblance to what campus life looks like here in Alabama. Right. I'll give you an example of this. There's been all of this critique, for example, about Palestinian protests, pro-Palestine protests on college campuses in the Northeast. All of these like allegations of anti-Semitism, this sort of thing. Meanwhile, in Alabama last year, we had neo-Nazis do anti-Semitic graffiti in chalk on campus, saying things like Kanye was right, when he was extolling Hitler. No news coverage. The Times didn't cover it. Nobody covered it, right? There was no statements, right? Big, bold statements about it. And so I'm curious why the Times is so fixated on Ivy League education. And I'm so curious why they're fixated on people that want us to think that the problem is leftists and liberals and not with the right, which itself is advocating for anti-Semitism vocally, and is targeting the teaching of critical thinking at higher education. And so that's my little soapbox.
I love the soapbox. Thank you, AJ. We appreciate it. We are not afraid of opinions on this show, and want to pull
takes.
in a few comments. MD was talking about when I made reference to the coverage of India in the Times. Their coverage on the reasons behind the failed vote in Ireland was way off base too. And this is, I think, what I've been hearing. I have a perspective on India coverage because I in terms of my family background and history, but I remember seeing the articles about the referendum in Ireland and had no way of knowing that it was off base. And I've heard from others as well, other articles about whether it's Japan, certainly Africa, Latin America, these dispatches are often of that same ilk. So thank you, MD, for those comments. Deborah says many progressive Jews feel New York Times articles, headlines, and photos are one-sidedly negative on Israel and almost mute on Hamas's harm to its own people. Mary Curtis is asking, how are you navigating these restrictive laws in your work while meeting the needs of all your students?
Yeah, so to answer the two there, the first one, and many people that are horrified by the wanton violence against Palestinian civilians find the Times' coverage not enough. So I'll just add that. As for Mary, that law just passed this past week, and so we're awaiting legal guidance to see what that's going to mean for us starting in the fall. The law goes into effect October 1st.
And Miriam says, great points about the New York Times fixation on the Ivy League and where most U.S. college students are educated. I hope he returns. So you already have a fan to come back on the show. Thank you.
Returns
AJ.
to the show or returns to Brooklyn? I'd love to return to Brooklyn too sometime.
I don't know.
I'll be there this summer.
We may need a clarification on that. The So that was in the business section. I do want to at least point out to folks, we won't spend too much time on it, but the sports baseball preview is here, and it's a nice cover image. We don't care if we never get back, and I make no. Everyone knows. First of all, I want to make sure people see the ticker. If you do want to be added to our mailing list, send me an email, neil@digimentors.group. Neil@digimentors.group, so you can get announcements for the shows and links to watch. About once a week is when we send out the email. But since we're talking about baseball, go Yankees every time. I am
Go
particularly
Rangers.
curious. You're a Rangers fan. I know, that's all right.
Long suffering, except for last year, thankfully.
No problems here. But I'm curious about what they did with the baseball preview, given that they have shuttered their their sports desk and went to the Athletic. So I'll be looking through this closely. We did an incredible show looking at the New York Times sports desk last summer when they first announced their shuttering. In addition to Bill Rhoden, Claire Smith was a guest as well. Several other luminaries. So I'll be curious to see how they're covering the baseball preview. Sunday opinion section has a couple of articles that I think are worth taking a look at. You mentioned Maureen Dowd earlier. So the Maureen Dowd column in the Sunday paper is this one about James Carville. I know that Mary Curtis was citing a Maureen Dowd column about Princess Kate, and as she quotes her royal expert buddy to express sympathy toward the princess and make a gratuitous swipe at Meghan Markle. Enough said. So that might be either an earlier column or an upcoming column. But what about this one about James Carville?
I mean, I have like a weird soft spot for James Carville because my aunt likes him, and my aunt lives in New Orleans. I think that they should have headlined this "Rage Within the Machine," and a friend of mine corrected me and said it should be "Rage on Behalf of the Machine." I don't know why we're still doing profiles on James Carville. He's like effectively retired or retiring, and again, I think that Maureen Dowd is, God love her, gives us a lot of entertainment on the Twitter. I don't know if Doug Balloon would be able to keep it up if Maureen wasn't keeping writing. But she hasn't said anything relevant in at least 20 years.
20
I know that's
years.
harsh. Iraq War, she said some great stuff. There was like a lot of good dunking on Bush, but like, come on, Maureen.
So there's another column here, and I want to take a moment with this because it's very disturbing, and it gives me a lot of pause, a lot to think about. This column by Nick Kristof. So I don't know if you had a chance to see this yet. Deep fake violations met with a shrug. The basic idea is that people are with the use of AI, people are taking pictures of women and girls, regular pictures, and even men and boys as well, and turning them into nudes that seem very realistic, and they're able to take pictures and put them into videos, and there's not much being done about it. There's some advocates who are trying to push back, but once a video gets out there, once pictures get out there, you can't. It's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. There isn't any legal recourse, any political recourse, but it's scary what they're doing with images, and we've had some a lot of interesting discussions on the show around AI, but also around the use of images of children, about how social media plays into it and the algorithms, etc. But I want to point out this article and make sure people get a chance to look at it if they can. This is Nick Kristof's piece, and I'm going to take a moment and drop the link in Facebook, at least, just so people can make it a point to see this, because this is too important to pass up.
Yeah, I think it's a really tragic thing that is unfortunately enabled by our new technology, but I don't think that I don't know what can be done under the way that the Supreme Court interprets the First Amendment, unfortunately, unless there's maybe some kind of torts that we can do in terms of suing the people that create this content, that the people who are violated could sue them. But yeah, it's a tricky issue.
Absolutely. So I encourage people to check that out. And then the other columns, this is a piece, American Jews in the Age of Palestine. The war in Gaza has upended political traditions for Jews in the U.S. And you're seeing that, unheard of criticism from Chuck Schumer, Senator Chuck Schumer of Prime Minister Netanyahu. You wouldn't have seen that 5 years ago, much less 10 or longer. Interesting article. Nothing makes baseball fun like trash talk. A little well-placed heckling could give the sport a lot more drama. So that's the opinion section. And I saw something that a colleague of mine will be interested. New York subways need elevators, not soldiers. The transit system isn't safe, but it's not for the reason you think. Our colleague Robert Anthony from Digimentors is a train aficionado. He will be very interested in that article.
Plus
so
one
that
to that
is,
take.
say
More
again?
more accessibility, less rifles in the subway. 100%.
Absolutely. And then so much we're not able to get to. We're at 10:01. Peter Townsend on Tommy. And I want to, you can only see the top half, but some people might be able to recognize him from that. Here's the full, trying to get more of his face in the shot, but that's the classic picture of Pete Townsend. We had the style section with Giselle Bundchen, book review, and the magazine. And we did not have time, unfortunately, to get to through the Voyages issue, but you'll be able to see many of these articles online. AJ, that time flew by.
I talked too much. I apologize
Not at all.
for stealing the spotlight from the New York Times. But yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Looking through some of the last comments, Miriam says, let's hope the law doesn't go into effect in October.
Well, though.
Absolutely. And Diana Rahini, AI scares me as a parent, deeply scares me. Absolutely. Dr. Tachi says, thank you, AJ and Neil. And our good friend Apollo joins us from Philadelphia. We'll catch what I missed on the rerun. Have a great week ahead. That's a great way to remind folks that if you did join us late, you'll be able to watch the recording from the beginning on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on our website. As soon as the show is over, it'll start up again. I'll need a little time to get it up on Instagram. If you're watching there, we have a number of other people. Wayne Camadoy joined on Instagram, as well as Ernest Scheider, who is a former guest on the show. So thank you to everyone watching on Instagram. And I do want to say, Stephen, thank you for having his book, Stephen Thrasher. Thank you for having his book on your bookshelf. He's
somewhere. There he is.
Appreciative of that. Somewhere there, right? You got to get the right side.
Yeah, I'm all turned around.
Doug Levy says, great conversation, lots of interesting insights. Jonathan, great program, important points. Thank you. And Michael says, glad I got to catch this today. So, Michael, first time I've seen your name in the comments. I don't know if you're a regular viewer and first time commenter, or maybe you're AJ. Do you know Michael by any chance? Or
I don't believe so, although I don't know. I'm bad with faces and names. So if I do, I'm sorry, Michael. But if I don't, then nice to meet you.
No worries. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. And Diana says, thank you for another great show. An interesting guest. I learned, I laughed, I grew. If that's not high praise, I don't know what is. Oh my God.
Thank you, Diana. That warms my heart this cold Sunday morning.
Absolutely. And Michael says, no, he's known Sri forever. So thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. Glad you were able to join us this morning and throw in a comment. I hadn't recognized your name, so my apologies. But with that, we're going to bring this show to a close. Again, as a reminder, we will not have a show next week because of Easter, but we'll be back April 7th with Indira Somani, and we're looking forward to her our conversation with her. Have a great weekend, and if you're for folks who are observing today, of course, is Palm Sunday, going into Easter week. Lots to think about over this next week, particularly if you have time off at home. Have a great weekend, and again, AJ, thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you so much for having me. Everybody have a great one.